But this is not only a war against Ukraine, it's a war against security in the world.
Every new military aid, financial aid, sanction package takes longer and longer, and it's harder to adapt.
We need to support Ukraine with more military capabilities. The support for Ukraine is a strategic investment for peace and security, and the world will be safer if we can support Ukraine, if we can make sure that the rules-based order is protected, is defended.
Thank you for agreeing to this interview, and obviously I will start with the main roadblocks that awaits Ukraine in December with the start of accession talks. What are they?
My intention is to do everything to make possible a positive decision, but you know that we need to decide by unanimity in the European Council. It's always challenging, but it's very important to give a very strong signal. Why? Because it's a question of moral duty, in my opinion, because the Ukrainians, you are fighting for our common democratic values and principles, but also because enlargement in those circumstances more than ever, this investment in peace, security and prosperity for the future. And that's why I sincerely hope that the European Council, our members, they will recognize the huge efforts made by the Ukrainian authorities in implementing reforms that are needed. And I hope that we can send a very positive signal. But it will require some political efforts to prepare this decision in the European Council.
How will you persuade Hungary to accept Ukraine? Will you unblock 13 billion euros in frozen funds?
No, you know that there are some suspicions expressed by some observers that the Hungarian position could be linked with some bilateral irritants between Hungary and the European Commission. But the most important thing for me is to make sure that the EU is acting in a geopolitical way. It means that we need to understand what's at stake, and what's at stake on the European continent. This is peace, security, prosperity. This EU project is based on those fundamental principles. Russia has decided to launch a war, a full-scale invasion, a full-scale war against Ukraine. But this is not only a war against Ukraine, it's a war against security in the world, including in Europe. That's why it is fundamental that the 27 member states make the right choices to make sure that we prepare a better future for our children and grandchildren.
The European Union promised 1 million shells to Ukraine. Obviously, they won't be able to produce 1 million shells till the deadline. Do you see this as an inability of the European Union to adapt to the war in Ukraine 20 months in?
Look, we have decided in a few months, in fact, to mobilize more than 82 billion euros in total for supporting Ukraine, and we are ready to do more. There is a proposal on the table to increase with an additional package of 50 billion euros for Ukraine. But in terms of ammunition, you are absolutely right that we need to speed up, we need to accelerate, and we've already provided 300,000 of rounds. It was at the latest numbers at the end of October, and we are working very hard to make sure that in the months to come we will increase our production. But this is showing that we are right when we are making the decision to develop the European defense and the European capabilities to support Ukraine, but also to make sure that in the future we will be stronger, more influential and more resilient.
Do you think that Ukraine should hold elections in 2024 if the war is not over?
Look, this is first and foremost a debate for the Ukrainians. This is my first point. And my second point, we must be realistic. This is very difficult to have an electoral campaign in those circumstances, but this is the responsibility of the Ukrainian authorities to make the decision.
Will Zelensky have the same credibility if he doesn't hold elections on time?
I can tell you that in Europe, and I'm certain this is the case in Ukraine, President Zelensky has a very strong credibility because he is very courageous, and this is also the image of the Ukrainian people. He's extremely active to defend the Ukrainian interests. He's extremely brave, and we want to support him, and we want to support the people of Ukraine as much as we can, for as long as it takes, because this is the right choice. This is a choice for democracy, for freedoms, for sovereignty, for independence.
Do you think that the slow arms production and delivery to Ukraine, and also the inability to choke Russia economically, is part why Ukraine counteroffensive failed?
I don't say, and I don't think that this counteroffensive is failing. Two examples: the way your Ukrainian army made huge progress in the Black Sea. This is extremely important. This is a major step in the right direction. Point one, and also the recent progress made on the other side of the Dnipro River. These are also very important signals. But you are absolutely right that we need to support Ukraine with more military capabilities. This is what we want to do. For instance, we've already trained more than 30,000 soldiers, and we will do more. We are trying to do more. If you mentioned the production within the European Union, this is true. That the current situation is showing that we need to speed up and to ramp up our production for supporting Ukraine, but also because in the future we understand that the EU, which is a very strong economic actor, which is very strong and powerful in terms of spreading common standards and common norms across the world, we need to develop more defense and security capabilities in the future.
Europe always says that it will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but every new military aid, financial aid, sanction package takes longer and longer, and it's harder to adopt. Do you actually think that in 2024 and 2025, Europe will still be able to produce this amount of support for Ukraine?
Yeah, in fact, if you observe what we are doing since the start of the full-scale invasion, we succeeded to decide on 11 packages of sanctions, and the 12th package is currently discussed. And we reacted very quickly, and we'll never forget the hours following the full-scale invasion when we were in the European Council meeting in Brussels. We decided the strategy, and we are following this strategy. Full support for Ukraine as much as we can, I repeat again, as much as we can, and sanctions against Russia. We know that sanctions, it takes some time before this has a real and a sustainable effect on a country. But can you imagine what would be the situation without this united support by the EU, by the Americans, and by other partners? It is very clear that in terms of financial support, for instance, at the beginning we made decisions case by case. Then we have decided to work on a multi-annual approach, which is much better to provide more predictability to the Ukrainian authorities. We are working closely with the IMF, for instance, to make sure that there is support in terms of macro-financial assistance. And each meeting I have with President Zelensky, each phone conversation I have with President Zelensky, we are discussing in depth what are the additional modalities, what are the additional concrete elements we can decide and put in place to strengthen our support for Ukraine and to maximize the impact of the sanctions against Russia, including by addressing the circumvention of sanctions and making sure that we convince many countries across the world not to allow Russia to escape to those sanctions.
Sorry, is it possible because Russia is able to obtain, for example, Czech parts or US parts for its rockets?
Look, the last package of sanctions we are discussing is directly inspired by the cooperation with our intelligence services and the Ukrainian intelligence services based on what we can see on the battlefield. For instance, we are now targeting more and more what we call the dual-use goods and the military goods, because it is very important to take into account how Russia is trying to adapt its industrial basis, and that's why in terms of circumvention of sanctions we constantly need to adapt our framework to try to reduce the possibilities for Russia to escape to the sanctions.
You also mentioned the US. Is it fair to say that the US elections will have a direct impact on the European Union and its support for Ukraine?
I want to be clear. I think that the EU, we are a very important partner and ally. This is very clear with the United States, but we have our own destiny, and we need to demonstrate that we are able to make our decisions. And I sincerely hope that we can count in the future on the full support of the United States. I'm very grateful to Joe Biden and his administration for this very close cooperation and this common approach on Ukraine and on the security on the European continent. But one thing is absolutely certain: for the European Union for Ukraine, for the candidate countries in the future. This is very important if you ask the question of the next electoral campaign in the United States. If you ask this question, it's very important to make sure that we have more domestic tools, we have more capabilities to be more resilient and to have more influence in the future.
Is the EU right now preparing for a potential Trump victory in the States?
We are determined to consolidate and to strengthen our support for Ukraine together with the United States. And we have a common interest. Well, last time, a few weeks ago, when I met with Joe Biden, we agreed on this principle that it's important for the Congress and for the people in the United States that they feel the unwavering support coming from the EU. And it's also important in the EU that we feel this strong commitment expressed by Joe Biden and by his team. There will be elections in the United States, there will be elections within the EU, okay, this is clear, but this is our duty today to make sure that the public opinion, our citizens in the United States and in Europe, they understand the seriousness of the situation. They understand that the support for Ukraine is a strategic investment for peace and security, and the world will be safer if we can support Ukraine, if we can make sure that the rules-based order is protected, is defended.
Do you think, like, for 2 years, the European Union and the US and Ukraine failed to persuade the global South to support Ukraine?
I have a nuanced answer, because I remember at the beginning of the war it was very difficult, because you are right that Russia started to develop a very aggressive narrative, like always, trying to rally the global South, giving the impression that in fact Russia was provoked and that Russia reacted following the NATO provocations, etc., etc. I think that we did a lot, and this is successful to convince a big part of the global South that Russia is making troubles across the world, and that the Russian behavior has a dramatic impact, a negative impact for the most vulnerable countries in terms of food insecurity, in terms of economic crisis, inflation, etc. But let's be honest. The situation in the Middle East is also used by Russia to try to attack the western part of the world, trying to spread the idea that there would be double standards, which is not true. We defend international law always and everywhere.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.